Emily Rose Whitaker pressed her last coin into that dying stranger's cracked palm and whispered, "You're going to be all right." She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from. She only knew he was breathing wrong, that shallow, rattling kind of breathing that meant a man was losing his argument with death. She gave him her water. She gave him her bread. She held his head off the burning ground until the shaking stopped. And while she was saving him, the bank was posting the notice on her gate. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The notice had been nailed to the gatepost sometime before sunrise. Emily Rose Whitaker found it when she came out to feed the horses. Still buttoning her dress with one hand, the other holding the lantern she no longer needed because dawn had already cracked open the Arizona sky in shades of copper and blood. She stood there in the dirt, the lantern swinging at her side, and read the notice twice. Then she read it a third time, because the first two times her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Notice of foreclosure. Property known as the Whitaker Ranch, Dry Creek County, Arizona Territory. Outstanding balance $600. Final date of settlement Friday, June 13th. $1,884. Failure to remit full payment will result in immediate seizure of property and all assets therein. Friday, that was 3 days away. She folded the notice very carefully, the way her mother used to fold letters she didn't want her father to see. And she put it into her apron pocket. Then she went and fed the horses. What else was she going to do? Her name was Emily Rose Whitaker, and she was 23 years old, and by most accounts in the town of Caldwell Crossing, Arizona, she was a curiosity more than a person. The kind of woman people talked about, but rarely to. She was big, genuinely big, the kind of big that made strangers on the street look twice and then pretend they hadn't. She stood 5'4" and carried herself in a way that took up space without apology, even though she spent most of her life being made to feel like that space belonged to someone else. Her face was round and open, with brown eyes that caught light like creek water, and a mouth that smiled easier than it had any right to. Given everything. Her hair was the color of dark mahogany, long and usually pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father. The dress she wore that morning was the same faded blue cotton she wore most mornings. The apron over it was off-white, gone to cream from washing. Her boots were cracked along the right heel and had been for 2 years. She was not what Caldwell Crossing would have called a beauty. Caldwell Crossing had very specific ideas about beauty, and about women, and about what a woman alone on a failing ranch ought to do with herself. You ought to sell, Dorothea Marsh had told her at the general store 3 weeks back. Loud enough for the whole room to hear. A woman your size running a cattle operation by herself? Lord have mercy, Emily. It ain't dignified. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Marsh, Emily had said, and she'd paid for her flour and walked out. She was good at walking out. She'd had a lot of practice. Her parents had died within 8 months of each other, her mother first, in the winter, from a fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. Her father lasted through spring and into summer, long enough to make her believe he might pull through. And then one morning she'd gone to wake him, and he was simply gone. Still and quiet in his bed, his hands folded on his chest like he'd done it himself. Like he'd decided it was time. He'd left her the ranch, 3 horses, 11 head of cattle, and a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell Crossing that had been accumulating interest since before Emily was born. He'd also left her his hat. She wore it every day. The ranch was 40 acres of hard Arizona land, rocky and dry in summer, frosted and unforgiving in winter, the kind of land that fought you every single morning and asked whether you were serious about staying. Emily was serious. She was up before the sun every day. She mended fences and hauled water and tracked the cattle and kept the books and made every dollar stretch until it screamed. She'd sold the two weaker horses. She'd reduced the herd to the strongest animals. She'd cut back on her own food before she cut back on theirs. $600. That was the number standing between her and everything her parents had built. $600 and 3 days to find it, and not a single idea in her head about where it was going to come from. She was riding the fence line that afternoon when she saw him. She almost didn't. The sun was brutal that time of day, hitting the white rock faces and bouncing back twice as hot. And she'd pulled her hat low and was squinting through the shimmer when she noticed something that didn't belong. A dark shape, low to the ground, off to the east, where the desert stretched out past her property line and became nothing but rock and sky and silence. She pulled Daisy up short. The shape wasn't moving. She sat there for a moment, one hand on the reins, the other shading her eyes. A man, it looked like a man lying in the open. No horse anywhere in sight. No shade, nothing. She should keep riding. She had 3 days and $600 to find. And no time for strangers. She turned Daisy east. He was older than she'd expected. 65, maybe 70, with a white beard gone gray at the edges and skin that had been burned and weathered and burned again, until it looked like the land itself. He was wearing clothes that had once been good, that much was visible even through the dust and the damage. A vest with brass buttons, a shirt that had been white. He was lying on his side with his cheek against the ground. And when Emily dropped to her knees beside him, she could hear him breathing barely, in shallow, ragged pulls that sounded like a man losing a slow argument with something bigger than himself. "Sir," she put her hand on his shoulder, firm. "Sir, can you hear me?" Not words, just a sound. She looked around again. No horse, no gear, no explanation for how a man this age ended up flat in the Arizona desert, without shade or water in the middle of June. She had one canteen. She'd refilled it at the trough before she rode out, and it was maybe 3/4 full. She needed that water. The ride back to the ranch was long, and the heat was not negotiating. She uncapped the canteen and lifted his head and pressed it to his lips. "Drink slow," she said. "Don't rush it. Nice and slow." He drank. His eyes came halfway open, pale gray, she noticed, the color of winter sky, and he looked at her like a man who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "There you go," she said. "You're all right. I've got you." Getting him onto Daisy was the hardest physical thing Emily had done in recent memory. And she'd done plenty of hard things. He was heavier than he looked, and barely conscious, and every time she got one part of him situated, another part would slip. She talked to him through the whole thing, a steady low murmur, "That's it. Just hang on, almost there. You're doing fine," partly to reassure him and partly to reassure herself, because her hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the weight. She walked Daisy back to the ranch on foot, leading the horse slow, one hand on the old man's knee to keep him balanced. It took almost 2 hours. Her boots were worn through to blistering by the time the gate came into view. She didn't think about the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket once. She got him settled in her father's old bedroom, the one she'd kept neat and closed since the funeral, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and boot leather. She built up the fire. She brought water and a cloth and worked on him methodically, cooling the sunburn, getting more water into him, checking for other injuries. He had a gash on his left palm already scabbing over, and his boots were in worse shape than hers. By the time he was cleaned up and covered with a quilt, the sun was going down, and Emily was sitting in the ladder-back chair beside the bed, watching him breathe and eating a biscuit she'd grabbed cold from the kitchen because she hadn't thought about eating since morning. He opened his eyes sometime around dusk. For a long moment he just looked at the ceiling. Then he turned his head and looked at her, and his expression shifted through several things very quickly: confusion, recognition, and then something quieter that she couldn't quite read. "Well," he said. His voice was rough and dry and carried a depth she hadn't expected. "I'm alive, you are," Emily said. "Because of you. You were in a bad way." I couldn't leave you out there." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people would have." "Well," she said, "I'm not most people." His mouth moved in a way that might have been a smile. "No. I expect you're not." He closed his eyes again briefly. Then opened them. "What's your name, miss?" "Emily Whitaker." "This is the Whitaker Ranch." "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Harrington." He paused. "I'm in your debt, Miss Whitaker. You don't owe me anything. Just rest." "That gash on my hand," he said, "my horse threw me. Came down wrong on the rock and I went over." He ran. He sounded more resigned than upset about it. Like a man reporting information rather than lodging a complaint. "I'd been down about 4 hours before you found me." 4 hours in that heat," Emily said. "You were lucky to be breathing." "I know it." He looked at her steadily. "You gave me your water. I had enough, you didn't." She met his gaze. "You needed it more." The fire crackled. Outside, one of the horses moved in the paddock, hooves quiet on the packed dirt. "Is there someone I can send word to?" Emily asked. "Family? Someone who'd be worried?" "No," Thomas said simply. "No one who'd worry." She nodded and didn't push it. She knew what it was to have no one who'd worry. She let him sleep through the night and through the next morning, checking on him every few hours. He was strong for a man his age. She could see that even in his diminished state. His breathing steadied. His color came back. By afternoon he was sitting up and drinking broth she'd made from the last of her dried beef. And by the following morning he was on his feet, moving slowly but under his own power, examining the ranch with the careful eyes of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. She found him standing at the paddock fence, watching her horses. "You've got good stock," he said when she came up beside him. "Better than I'd have expected for a spread this size. My father knew horses. He knew this land too. By the look of it. Fencing's well placed, water situation's smart." He glanced at her. "You've kept it up. I've tried to, more than tried." He turned to look at the ranch house, the barn, the outbuildings. His gray eyes moved across everything with a quiet precision that she was beginning to recognize. "You're running this alone?" "I am." "How long?" 8 months. He turned back to the horses. "That's a considerable thing, Miss Whitaker." "It's my home," she said. "How many head of cattle?" 11 now. "I sold 2 in the fall." "And the debt?" She looked at him sharply. "I didn't mention a debt." "No, but there's a foreclosure notice tacked back on your gatepost. Blew loose while you were out this morning. I tacked it back up for you." He said it without apology, without embarrassment, just stating what he'd seen. $600, Friday. Emily kept her eyes on the horses. Her jaw was very tight. "That's not your concern, Mr. Harrington." "Perhaps not, but it is my observation." He paused. "Have you spoken to the bank?" "I've spoken to the bank. And Mr. Beaumont at the bank made it very clear that extensions are not available to accounts in my category." "What category is that?" She looked at him. "Undesirable." Something shifted in his expression. "Is that the word he used?" That was the polite version. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "And Caldwell?" he said. "Does he come into this at all?" The name hit her like a fist. "You know William Caldwell?" "I know of him." Thomas's voice had gone carefully neutral. "He's got interests in this county. Railroad interests. Among other things." Emily's hands tightened on the fence rail. "He's offered to buy the ranch 4 times in the past 2 months. The price drops every time he asks. And the bank's patience runs short at a convenient moment." "I'm sure that's coincidence," Emily said flatly. "I'm sure it's not." Thomas turned to look at her fully. And for the first time she felt the weight of his attention, not the attention of an old man being polite to the woman who'd saved his life, but something else, something with edges. "Miss Whitaker, I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer me honestly. I usually do. What would you do with this ranch if you could keep it?" She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you want it because it was your parents'? Or do you want it because it's what you want to build?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that. Not one person in 8 months had asked her what she actually wanted. Both, she said finally. It's my parents because they built it, and it's mine because I know what it could be. The grazing land to the north hasn't been touched. If I could run a proper-sized herd 60 head, maybe more, and get access to the Prescott rail line for shipping, she stopped herself. It doesn't matter what I'd do with it. None of it matters if I don't have $600 by Friday. Thomas nodded slowly. Go about your day, he said. I'd like to rest a bit more. If that's all right with you. Of course it's all right. She pushed off the fence. There's more broth on the stove, Miss Whitaker. She turned back. Thank you, he said, for the water, and for everything after. Caldwell came the following morning. He came the way he always came, with 2 men behind him, and his horse out front, and his hat tilted at the angle he used when he wanted people to understand exactly who was in charge of the conversation before it started. He was 52 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had since gone hard in the way that happened to men who got used to winning. Emily was in the yard when he rode in. She didn't go to meet him. She stood where she was and waited. Miss Whitaker, Caldwell said. Pulling up. He looked down at her from the saddle, with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. You look tired. I'm fine, thank you. I heard you've had some trouble. Thought I'd ride out, personally. He glanced around the property with the easy possessiveness of a man who'd already decided something belonged to him. Looks like she's starting to go to seed a bit. Shame. The ranch is in fine condition, Emily said. Sure. His eyes came back to her. I want to make you another offer. Emily. Last one, I'll be clear about that. I'm being more than generous here. Given the state of things. $500. Cash money. Today. The ranch is worth $4,000. The ranch is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. And I'm the only person in this county willing to pay anything at all. His voice had gone easy and smooth, the way a man's voice got when he wasn't used to being argued with. Look at the situation you're in, sweetheart. You're a young woman alone. You're carrying a debt you can't pay, and Friday's coming whether you like it or not. Take the $500, walk away clean, and go find yourself a life somewhere you're better suited for. Better suited, Emily repeated. No offense meant. He said it the way people said it when they meant every offense in the world. But he gestured broadly at the ranch, at her. At all of it. This ain't working. It's a woman you're... He paused. Chose the word carefully. A woman in your circumstances. Out here alone. It just ain't practical. Emily looked at him for a long, quiet moment. My answer is no, she said. His expression shifted. Just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. You sure about that? I'm sure, Emily. His voice dropped, losing the easy warmth. The bank isn't going to wait. I've spoken with Beaumont, and he's not in a position to... I'm sure you've spoken with him, Emily said. I'm sure you've spoken with a number of people. She kept her voice steady. My answer is still no, Mr. Caldwell. This ranch belongs to my family. It is not for sale. The 2 men behind him exchanged a glance. Caldwell looked at her for another moment, assessing, recalculating, and then he settled back in his saddle with a kind of deliberate ease. Friday, he said. We'll see where things stand on Friday. He turned his horse and rode out. Emily stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then she sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands and let herself be afraid for exactly 60 seconds. Because she'd found that 60 seconds was usually enough. 60 seconds, and then you stood up and went back to work. She counted them off, stood up and went back to work. Thomas was in the kitchen when she came in. He'd found the coffee and made a pot, and was sitting at the table with a cup and a piece of paper covered in figures in small, precise handwriting. He looked up when she came through the door. Caldwell just left, she said. I know, I heard. He nodded at the chair across from him. Sit down, Miss Whitaker. Sit down. Please, she sat. He turned the paper so she could see it. She looked at the figures, columns of numbers, acreage notations. what looked like estimated cattle values and land assessments. "You've been doing your research," she said. "I've been doing some thinking." He set his coffee down. "I want to be straight with you, because you've been nothing but straight with me. I am a man of some means. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And I have some history with the kind of operation Caldwell is running that you may find relevant." Emily looked at him carefully. "What kind of history?" "The railroad kind." He met her eyes. "There's a spur line being planned through this county. The routing decisions are still being finalized. Your land sits on the best possible corridor, not Caldwell's current holdings. Which is why he wants yours so badly. He's been telling investors the routing is settled. It's not. And if this ranch gets absorbed into his holdings before the survey is complete, he walks away with a windfall that he's been engineering by fraud." The kitchen was very quiet. "How do you know all this?" Emily asked. Thomas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "Because," he said, "I'm the man making the routing decisions." Emily sat very still. She stopped. He held her gaze. "I told you, Thomas Harrington." "Thomas Harrington." She repeated the name slowly. And then something clicked, some half-heard conversation. Some mention years ago in her father's presence. "Thomas Edward Harrington." "Yes, the railroad, yes." She sat back in her chair. She looked at this old man in his borrowed clothes, drinking coffee at her kitchen table, and she tried to reconcile what she'd thought he was with what he was telling her. "You were dying in my desert," she said finally. "I was," he agreed. "My horse threw me and I couldn't get up, and 4 hours in that heat was about as close as I've come." He paused. "I had no identification on me. My gear was with the horse. I was nobody out there, and I gave you water," Emily said quietly. "You gave a stranger your last water, when you had every reason in the world to ride past." She looked down at her hands on the table. "I didn't know who you were." "I know you didn't." His voice was very quiet. "That's precisely the point, Miss Whitaker." Outside, a horse whinnied in the paddock. The coffee pot settled with a small metallic click. Emily pressed her lips together and looked up. "Harrington," she said, "I want you to hear me very clearly. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I don't want charity. I don't want to be saved. If there's justice to be had where William Caldwell is concerned, I want that because it's right, not because I happened to find you in a field." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I have been in business for 40 years. I have met all kinds of people in that time. Men who'd walk over you to get what they want. Women who'd smile while they did it, and every variation in between." He paused. "Charity is giving someone something they didn't earn. That's not what I'm talking about." "Then what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you have 40 acres of good land, a working water system, 11 head of quality cattle, and the clearest head for ranch management I've seen in a decade." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm talking about the fact that you've kept this place alive for 8 months by yourself. In impossible circumstances, with no help from anyone in this town." He paused. "And I'm talking about the fact that what William Caldwell has done to this county is illegal, and that I intend to make that known to the appropriate people, and that when the dust settles, the routing of that rail line is going to be decided on merit and geography, not on fraud." Emily's heart was beating very hard. "The $600 is a detail," Thomas said. "The larger question is whether you want to fight." She looked at him. She thought of her father in his hat, her mother folding letters she didn't want seen. She thought of Dorothea Marsh and Caldwell's easy contempt, and Beaumont at the bank who hadn't met her eyes. She thought of 60 seconds on the porch steps, counting off fear. "I've been fighting," Emily said, "every day for 8 months." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then let's fight together," he said. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a candle and the foreclosure notice smoothed flat in front of her. She read it again. Then she turned it over and began to write on the back all the things she knew, all the things Thomas had told her, all the threads she could see beginning to connect. William Caldwell. The bank, the railroad, the land. She wrote until the candle burned low and her hand ached, and the night was fully dark around her. Then she folded the paper, put it in her apron pocket next to the foreclosure notice, blew out the candle and went to bed. Friday was coming. She was ready to meet it. She was up before dawn the next morning. And Thomas was already at the kitchen table. He hadn't slept much either, she could tell by the way he held his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it, like it was the only warm thing in the world. The paper she'd written on the night before was sitting in the middle of the table, and he'd added his own notations alongside hers in that small, precise hand. "You've been busy," she said, "so have you?" He nodded at the chair. "Sit. I want to walk you through something." She sat, and he began to talk. He talked for nearly an hour. He talked about the railroad spur, about the survey routes, about the 3 men William Caldwell had paid to falsify land assessments in the county over the past 2 years. He talked about a lawyer in Prescott named Aldous Webb who had been quietly building a case against Caldwell for 18 months but needed one critical piece: a witness willing to speak, and documentation of the bank collusion. He talked about the investors back east who believed Caldwell's land holdings were legitimate and who would pull their money the moment they understood what they'd actually bought into. Emily listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You've known about Caldwell for a long time." "Long enough. Then why hasn't anything been done?" Thomas set his cup down. "Because in this territory, Miss Whitaker, knowing something and proving it are 2 very different animals. Caldwell's been careful. He doesn't put anything in writing that can hurt him. He uses intermediaries. He applies pressure quietly, through people like Beaumont at the bank, and the county assessor, and the 2 sheriff's deputies who'd rather look the other way." He paused. "What he's done to you, the bank pressure, the timed foreclosure, the undervalued offers, that's the pattern. But each piece on its own looks like ordinary business. So we need the full picture. We need the full picture in front of the right people." He looked at her steadily. "I have a meeting scheduled in Prescott in 6 days. I was on my way there when my horse threw me. That meeting includes 3 railroad board members and Aldous Webb. If I walk in with documented evidence of Caldwell's manipulation of this specific land situation, timed offers, bank coordination, fraudulent assessments, it changes everything." Emily looked at the paper between them. 3 days, she said. "We have 3 days before Friday, I know. The bank won't extend. Not if Caldwell is telling Beaumont not to." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "But there may be another way. Beaumont isn't stupid. He's a man who went along with something because he thought the risk was low and the benefit was high. If that calculations changes, you think he'd turn on Caldwell?" "I think men like Beaumont turn on whoever is losing," Thomas said simply. "The question is making him understand that Caldwell is going to lose." Emily sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about Beaumont at the bank, his neat suit, his carefully neutral expression when he'd told her extensions weren't available for accounts in her category. She thought about the way he'd avoided her eyes. "He knows it's wrong," she said quietly. "What he's been doing. He knows. Most people who do wrong things know it," Thomas said. "That's not usually what stops them." "Then what does?" "Consequences," Thomas said. "Real ones. Visible ones." She looked at him. "I'm suggesting," he said, "that we pay Mr. Beaumont a visit today, before Caldwell has a chance to speak to him again." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up, smoothed her apron, and reached for her hat. "All right," she said, "let's go." Thomas looked at her for a second. And this time the thing that moved across his face was unmistakably a smile. "I'll get my boots," he said. The ride into Caldwell Crossing took 40 minutes on a good day. Emily pushed it to 30. She didn't talk much on the ride in. And Thomas didn't seem to require conversation. He rode beside her. She'd given him the loan of her second horse, a steady roan named Luther, who didn't mind strangers and watched the landscape pass with the same quiet attentiveness he seemed to bring to everything. It was Thomas who spoke first. About 10 minutes out from town. Your father. Tell me about him. Emily glanced over. Why? Because he raised you to give water to strangers in the desert. And I'm curious about the man who did that. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. His name was Robert Whitaker. He came out here from Ohio when he was 19 years old with $40 and a mule. He built the ranch from nothing, literally nothing. Just him and the land and the idea that it could be something. She paused. He used to say that the land didn't care who you were. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, big or small, man or woman. It only cared what you did with it. A practical philosophy. He was a practical man. Something softened in her voice. But not cold. He saw people. You know how some people look at you and you can tell they're actually looking? He was like that. He remembered names. He remembered what mattered to people. She paused again. He would have given that man in the desert water, too. Without even thinking about it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a man worth being the daughter of, he said. Emily looked straight ahead. He was, she said. He really was. The First Territorial Bank of Caldwell Crossing sat on the main street between the dry goods store and the telegraph office. A squat stone building that had always struck Emily as aggressively solid, the kind of building that wanted you to understand that money lived here, and you probably didn't. She'd been inside it a dozen times over the past 8 months. Each visit a little worse than the last. She tied Luther and Daisy outside and led the way in. The bank was quiet that time of morning. 2 teller cages, both staffed, and at the back behind a low wooden railing. The desk that belonged to Gerald Beaumont, bank manager. According to the sign on its edge, Beaumont himself was behind the desk, going over papers with the expression of a man who enjoyed paperwork more than he enjoyed most people. He looked up when Emily pushed through the railing gate. Miss Whitaker, he said, and the pleasant blankness dropped over his face immediately. The expression he used when he wanted to look cooperative without actually being cooperative. I wasn't expecting. We don't have an appointment. No, Emily said. We don't. I'd like a few minutes of your time, Mr. Beaumont. This is Mr. Harrington. He'll be sitting in. Beaumont looked at Thomas. Something flickered, recognition, uncertainty, and then the blankness returned. Of course, he said. Please sit down. They sat across the desk. Beaumont folded his hands on top of his papers with the careful deliberateness of a man who wanted to control the conversation he hadn't started. As I've explained, Miss Whitaker, the bank's position hasn't. Beaumont, Thomas said. The way he said it stopped Beaumont mid-sentence. Not loud, not sharp, just weighted in a way that made the words feel like they came from somewhere with significantly more authority than a bank manager's back office. Beaumont looked at him. My name is Thomas Harrington, Thomas said. I believe you may know the name in connection with the Western Pacific Railroad. Beaumont went very still. The papers under his hands suddenly seemed to require his complete attention. I cleared his throat. Of course. Yes, good. Thomas folded his hands in his lap with an ease that Emily found almost theatrical. Then we can speak plainly. I've spent the past 2 days reviewing what I can see of the situation in this county. And I have some concerns about the bank's relationship with certain land acquisition activities being conducted by William Caldwell. Specifically regarding the timing of foreclosure actions on properties along the proposed rail corridor. Beaumont's complexion had gone from its normal ruddy color to something approaching gray. I assure you, the bank's activities are entirely Gerald. Thomas's voice hadn't risen. But the first name landed like a flat stone. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because I believe you are a man who got in deeper than he meant to, and who may be looking for a way to conduct himself more correctly going forward. He paused. I'm offering you that opportunity. The silence in the back office was complete. One of the tellers called something out front, and a customer answered. And the sounds came through the glass partition, muffled and distant. Beaumont looked at Emily. She held his gaze steadily. The foreclosure on Miss Whitaker's property, Thomas said. Needs to be extended. 90 days would be appropriate, given the circumstances. In the meantime, I'll expect the bank to cooperate fully with an inquiry from Aldous Webb's office in Prescott. He paused. That cooperation is your best path forward, Gerald. I want you to understand that. Beaumont's jaw moved twice without producing words. Then he said very quietly, Caldwell won't. Caldwell isn't going to be in a position to do much of anything in about a week's time, Thomas said. I'd start making decisions based on that reality rather than his current one. Another silence. Beaumont looked down at his hands. 90 days, he said finally. He said it to the desk, not to either of them. 90 days, Thomas confirmed. Beaumont nodded once. He looked up at Emily, and she saw the guilt he'd been carrying clearly visible for just a moment before he put the blankness back. Miss Whitaker, he said, I'll have the amended paperwork drawn up this afternoon. Thank you. Mr. Beaumont, Emily said. She kept her voice even. She followed Thomas out through the railing and back through the lobby and out the front door. And she didn't say anything until they were outside on the boardwalk and the door had closed behind them. Then she exhaled a long, slow breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. You didn't threaten him, she said. No, but he was terrified. Men like Beaumont aren't terrified of threats, Thomas said. They're terrified of being on the wrong side. He glanced at her. He'll extend the deadline. He'll cooperate with Webb. Not because he's good, but because he's figured out which direction this is falling. Emily put her hat back on. And Caldwell, when he finds out, he'll find out today. Someone in that bank will tell him within the hour. Thomas looked down the main street. Easy and unhurried. That's fine. Let him know something's changed. Let him start scrambling. Emily followed his gaze down the street. And that was when she saw Margaret Doyle. Margaret Doyle was 60 years old and had lived in Caldwell Crossing her entire life. And she was standing outside the dry goods store with 2 flour sacks at her feet and an expression on her face that Emily recognized. It was the expression people wore when they'd been watching something happen for a long time and had decided they were done pretending they hadn't. Emily Whitaker, Margaret said, as Emily and Thomas came along the boardwalk. I've been meaning to get to you. Emily stopped. Mrs. Doyle, I heard about the bank. Margaret's voice was low and direct. She didn't look at Thomas. Not yet. She was looking at Emily with the intensity of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it. I heard what Beaumont told you 2 weeks ago. About accounts in your category. The words came out edged with a contempt that wasn't directed at Emily. My Harry had his assessment done 3 months back. The county put his land at half what it should be. Same as the Hennessy parcel and the Ortega place too. She paused. All of it land Caldwell's been after. Emily looked at her. You think it's the same situation, I know it is. Margaret finally looked at Thomas, taking him in with a frank assessment that reminded Emily oddly of her own father. Who's this? Thomas Harrington, Emily said. He's been helping me understand the situation. Margaret looked at Thomas for one more second, then back at Emily. There are 6 families in this county who've been pushed the same way you've been pushed. Lower assessments, tighter bank terms, convenient timing on debts coming due. Nobody talks because nobody thinks talking will do any good. She pressed her lips together. But if there's something actually happening, if somebody with some weight behind them is actually looking at Caldwell, then maybe that changes things. Thomas spoke for the first time. Mrs. Doyle, would you be willing to document what happened to your husband's assessment? Names, dates, amounts? Margaret Doyle looked at him with an expression that said she'd been waiting for exactly this question. Already have, she said. I've been keeping a record for 4 months. Didn't know who to take it to. She paused. I'll bring it to Emily's place this afternoon. If that suits. That suits very well, Thomas said. The afternoon brought Margaret Doyle. And Margaret brought her ledger, a battered composition book filled with dates and figures and names written in the careful hand of a woman who'd understood that she was recording something that mattered. She sat at Emily's kitchen table and walked them through it entry by entry. And what it showed was a pattern so clear and so deliberate that Emily felt her chest tighten with the effort of staying calm while she listened. 16 months. Systematically undervalued land. Coordinated bank pressure, and in 3 cases, outright falsified assessment documents bearing the signature of County Assessor Dale Pitts, who, Emily now understood, had been on Caldwell's payroll for 2 years. Dale Pitts, Thomas said, when Margaret came to that section. You know him? Emily asked. I know his signature. It's on some survey documents I've been reviewing. Something hardened in Thomas's expression, brief but unmistakable. He's been more involved in this than I understood. Margaret looked between them. How much trouble is Caldwell actually in? Enough, Thomas said. If we can get this documentation to Prescott before Friday. Friday's 2 days off, Margaret said flatly. I know. He looked at Emily. I need to send a telegraph to Prescott today. To Aldous Webb. And I need someone who can ride to the Hennessy place and the Ortega place and whoever else you know, Mrs. Doyle, and ask them to put their accounts in writing before Thursday morning. I can do that, Margaret said immediately. It could make you a target, Emily said, looking at her. If Caldwell figures out what we're building, Emily. Margaret's voice was dry. My Harry can barely afford to cede his north field because of what Dale Pitts did to our assessment. I've been a target, I just haven't been fighting back. She closed her ledger and set her hands flat on it. That stops today. Emily looked at her for a moment, at this woman she'd known her whole life, who'd been part of the town that had watched her struggle and mostly looked away, who was sitting at her kitchen table now, with fire in her eyes and a ledger full of evidence, and she felt something shift in her chest that she didn't entirely have words for. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Margaret stood and picked up her ledger. We should have done this months ago, every one of us. She paused at the kitchen door. I'll be at the Hennessy place by nightfall. I'll have their statement by morning. She left, and the kitchen was quieter without her. Thomas picked up his pen and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. I'll draft the telegraph. Can your horses make 2 round trips to town today? They can make 3 if they need to, Emily said. She was the one who rode the telegraph in. Thomas wrote it, and she read it twice, coded enough that a casual reader wouldn't understand it. Clear enough that Aldous Webb, who apparently knew Thomas's particular shorthand, would understand immediately, and then she folded it, put it in her breast pocket, and rode into Caldwell Crossing for the 2nd time that day. The telegraph office was run by a man named Silas Pruitt, who was generally understood to be the town's most reliable gossip, which meant that Emily handed him the message with a careful blankness and waited while he tapped it out without letting him see. Her hands were not entirely steady. Reply expected, Silas asked in that performatively casual way he had. If one comes, Emily said. Send it out to the ranch. She was halfway back out the door when Silas said, Miss Whitaker. She turned. Silas was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not quite guilt, not quite sympathy, something partway between. I saw Caldwell's man come in this morning, he said quietly. He sent a message to somebody in Phoenix. I don't know who. He paused. I thought you should know that. Emily looked at him steadily. Thank you, Silas. I got kids, he said by way of explanation. And a conscience. Both of them been giving me trouble lately. She rode back to the ranch at a pace that was faster than she'd ridden in a long time. The reply came before supper. One of Margaret Doyle's grandchildren brought it out on horseback. Silas had apparently decided that sending a telegraph reply to a ranch was less discreet than sending a 10-year-old boy, which said something about Silas's relationship with discretion that Emily didn't have time to examine. The boy handed her a folded paper and was offered a biscuit and consumed it with the focused dedication of someone who'd ridden hard and earned it. Emily took the paper inside. Thomas read it, and his expression shifted not to relief exactly, but to something that settled, like a man who'd been holding something at careful tension and had just received confirmation that his grip was correct. Webb is coming, he said. To town. He's leaving Prescott tomorrow, with 2 of the board members. He looked up. He's been waiting for me to surface with something solid. Mrs. Doyle's ledger and the testimony from the other families, that's solid. He set the paper down. We need everything compiled and organized by Thursday morning. Emily looked at the pile of notes and documents accumulating on her kitchen table. I'll work through the night if I have to. You won't have to. I'll help. He paused. I should tell you something. Miss Whitaker. The way he said it made her set down the paper she'd picked up. Tell me. The man Caldwell sent a telegram to this morning, Thomas said. If it was who I think it was, a man named Percy Cross, who operates as Caldwell's legal fixer, then Caldwell knows the situation is changing. He'll move faster now. He looked at her directly. I want you to be prepared for the fact that tomorrow may not be quiet. Emily absorbed this. What does moving faster look like? Pressure. Possibly uglier pressure than you've seen so far. He paused. He may try to get to the other families before they can give their statements. He may try to get to you directly. He already tried to get to me directly, Emily said. It didn't work. This time he may not come to offer to buy. The kitchen was very still. I understand, Emily said. I want to be sure you do. His voice was careful. You've shown extraordinary courage, but courage and recklessness aren't the same thing. If Caldwell, Mr. Harrington, she met his eyes. I was born on this land. I'm not leaving it, not for Caldwell. And not because things might get harder before they get better. She paused. That's not courage. That's just who I am. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. Then let's get to work, he said. They worked until well past midnight. Thomas organized, Emily wrote. She had a clear, precise hand. Her mother had insisted on it. Drilling letters at the kitchen table, while Emily was young enough to find it annoying, and she moved through the documentation systematically. Creating a timeline, cross-referencing Margaret's ledger against the bank notices she'd saved. Against the assessment records Thomas had obtained from somewhere he didn't entirely explain. Around 10 o'clock, Thomas said, without looking up from what he was doing, Your father saved my life once. Emily's pen stopped moving. What? He kept his eyes on his work for a moment. And then he looked up. 1,861. I was 26 years old. Coming through Arizona territory for the first time. Scouting rail routes. I got caught in a flood, one of those canyon floods that comes out of nowhere. My horse drowned and I nearly did. He paused. A rancher pulled me out. Young man, couldn't have been more than 20 himself. Name was Robert Whitaker. Emily had gone completely still. He dried me out and fed me and lent me a horse to get to the next town, Thomas said. I tried to give him money. He wouldn't take it, said. He paused again. Something in his face going gentle. He said a man didn't help another man for money. He did it because that was what decent people did. The words landed in the quiet kitchen like something physical. He never told me, Emily whispered. No, he wouldn't have. Thomas looked at her steadily. I've thought about Robert Whitaker many times over the years. Tried twice to find out what became of him, but the territory is large and records are poor. He set his pen down. And then I was lying on the ground in the Arizona sun. More certain than I've ever been that I was dying. And a young woman in a blue dress climbed off her horse and put water to my lips. He paused. You have his eyes, Miss Whitaker. I knew before you told me your name. Emily pressed her hand flat on the table. The candle between them wavered.
Why didn't you tell me sooner?
Because I wanted you to understand that what I'm doing here. I'm doing because it's right, not because of an old debt. Not out of sentiment. His voice was quiet and completely steady. Your father helped me because that was what decent people did. You helped me for the same reason. That's the thing that matters. The rest is just. The rest is the world working the way it ought to. For once. She looked at him for a long time. He would have liked you, she said finally. I liked him very much, Thomas said simply. In 20 minutes of knowing him. She picked up her pen. They went back to work. At 2 in the morning. She made coffee and he drank it without complaint. and at 3 she was copying a final summary of the timeline when she heard hoofbeats outside. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. Thomas was up just as fast, which surprised her. He moved with more speed than she expected from a man his age. He put out a hand in a way that wasn't quite stop but was close to it. They listened. 2 horses, maybe 3, coming in at a walk, deliberate. Not rushed. Stopping outside the gate, Emily went to where her father's rifle lived on the wall beside the door. She'd loaded it that morning, something she'd taken to doing in recent weeks. "Stay here," she said. "That's not." She looked back at him, and her voice was completely level. "Stay here." She opened the door. The night was clear and cold, the stars thick overhead. 3 men on horseback just outside the gate. She recognized 2 of them, Caldwell's regular men. The pair who'd ridden in behind him 2 mornings ago. The third she didn't know. She stood in the doorway with the rifle and said nothing. The 3 men looked at her. One of the horses shifted. The one in the middle, not one of Caldwell's regulars. The stranger spoke, Miss Whitaker. His voice was flat and businesslike. "We're not here for trouble. Mr. Caldwell has a revised offer. He's authorized me to go to $800. Cash. Tonight. $800. $100 more than the debt she owed." Emily looked at the 3 men in the dark. She thought about the kitchen table covered in documents. About Margaret Doyle's ledger. About Aldous Webb writing from Prescott. About her father pulling a young man out of a canyon flood and refusing payment because that was what decent people did. "Tell Mr. Caldwell," she said, "that my answer is no. That it will remain no. And that sending men to my property in the middle of the night to deliver that answer is the last time that will happen." The stranger looked at her for a moment, at the rifle, at her face, at whatever he saw there. "Ma'am," he said, "you are not making this easy on yourself." "No," Emily said. "I'm not." She held the rifle steady. "Good night." "Gentlemen." They left. She stood in the doorway and listened to the hoofbeats until they faded completely into the dark. Then she went inside and put the rifle back on the wall and turned around to find Thomas standing in the middle of the kitchen with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. He looked, she realized, genuinely moved. $800, he said. "Yes. He's panicking." "Good," Emily said. She went back to the table and picked up her pen. "Let's make sure he keeps panicking." She wrote until the candle burned out. And then she lit another one, and she kept writing. Outside, the Arizona sky began, very slowly, to go gray at the edges. Thursday was coming, and Thursday meant everything was about to change. Thursday arrived the way trouble always does, quietly. And then all at once, Emily had slept 3 hours. She knew it was 3 because she'd looked at the clock before she closed her eyes and looked at it again when she opened them. And the arithmetic was not encouraging. But she was up and dressed and had coffee on the stove before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Moving through the morning with the focused economy of someone who understood that today required everything she had. Thomas was already at the table when she came into the kitchen. He hadn't slept at all, as far as she could tell. The documentation was organized into 4 neat stacks, each bound with string, each topped with a summary page in his careful handwriting. He looked up when she came in, assessed her with those quiet gray eyes, and said nothing about how she looked. She appreciated that. "Webb's party should reach town by midday," he said. "Possibly earlier if they rode through the night. And Caldwell? We'll know they're coming, if he doesn't already." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "The question is what he does with that knowledge." She poured her coffee and sat down. "The Hennessy statement, did Margaret get it?" She sent word at first light. "Hennessy, Ortega, and a family named Briscoe that I didn't know about. 3 additional documented cases of fraudulent assessment." He paused. "Mrs. Doyle is a remarkable woman." "She is," Emily said. "She always was. I just didn't know she was angry. A lot of people in this town are angry," Thomas said. "They just needed somewhere to put it." Emily drank her coffee and looked at the 4 stacks of documents on her table, months of fraud laid out in paper and ink, and the careful handwriting of people who'd been quietly keeping records, 'cause some part of them knew. Eventually, that records would matter. She thought about all the mornings she'd been up before dawn working this land alone. All the times she'd walked into town and felt the weight of other people's opinions pressing down on her like a physical thing. She thought about Caldwell's man in the dark, with his $800 offer and his flat voice. "You are not making this easy on yourself." No, she thought. But easy was never really the option, was it? "I need to ride to the Doyle place," she said. "To pick up the statements." Thomas nodded. "I'll go with you. You should stay here." "If Webb's man comes ahead, Emily." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss. And it stopped her. He said it simply, like a fact. "I'm not sending you out alone today. Not after last night." She looked at him across the table. He looked back, steady and immovable as bedrock. "All right," she said. "We go together." They were saddled and out the gate before 7. And they'd made it barely a quarter-mile down the road when they found Jimmy Ortega waiting for them. He was 16 years old, the youngest of the Ortega boys, and he'd been riding hard enough that his horse was lathered. He pulled up when he saw them, and his face did something complicated, relief and urgency, mixing together in the way they did on young faces that hadn't learned to hide things yet. "Miss Whitaker," he said, breathing fast. "I was coming to you." "Papa said to come straight to you." Emily pulled Daisy up. "What happened?" "Caldwell's man, the one called Cross, he came to our place last night." "After midnight." Jimmy's jaw was tight. He told Papa that if he signed any statement or talked to any lawyer from Prescott, he'd make sure the county came and found violations on our property. Said he'd have our water rights reviewed. He swallowed. "Papa's scared. He didn't want to be, but he is. He's got 7 kids and Mama's been sick and Jimmy." Emily's voice was gentle but direct. "Did your father sign anything for Cross?" "No, ma'am. He told him to get off our land." A flash of pride crossed the boy's face. "But Cross said he'd be back this morning for an answer." Thomas looked at Emily. Emily looked at Thomas. "Ride back to your father," Thomas said to Jimmy. And his voice carried that particular quality Emily had come to recognize, quiet authority that didn't require volume to land. "Tell him that Aldous Webb is arriving in Caldwell Crossing today. Federal Railroad Commission authority. Cross has no power over your water rights. That's a county matter. And the county assessor is about to have significant problems of his own." He paused. "Tell your father that the only thing Cross can do to your family right now is talk. And in approximately 48 hours, talking will be the least of Cross's concerns." Jimmy stared at him. "Who are you, mister?" "Someone who's been where your father is," Thomas said simply. "Tell him to hold." The boy looked at Emily. She gave him a single nod. He turned his horse and rode. Emily watched him go. "Cross moved faster than you expected." "Yes." Thomas's voice was flat. "Which means Caldwell is more rattled than I expected. Men like Cross don't do midnight visits unless someone's panicking." He looked at her. "We need to get to town before Webb arrives." Not after. They pushed the horses to a canter. Margaret Doyle was standing outside her front gate with a leather satchel in her hand and her hat already on, which told Emily everything she needed to know about Margaret's red on the morning. "Cross went to the Ortega place," Emily said before Margaret could speak. "And the Hennessy place," Margaret said, her voice hard as a struck match. "Harlan Hennessy came over at 6 this morning. Cross told him the same thing, water rights. County violations, all of it." She thrust the satchel toward Emily. "All 4 statements are in there. Signed, dated, witnessed by me. If Cross wants to play that game, he's going to need to do it in front of a lawyer who knows what fraud actually looks like." Emily took the satchel. "Are you coming into town?" she asked. Margaret was already moving toward her own horse, tied at the fence post. "Try and stop me," she said. Caldwell Crossing at 8:30 on a Thursday morning looked like every other Thursday morning. On the surface, the dry goods was open. The smithy was already loud. 2 wagons were parked outside the feed store. But Emily felt it as soon as they rode in. The quality of attention was different. People were noticing more carefully. Conversations that stopped when they passed. Eyes that followed and then cut away. The town knew something was happening. She rode straight to the sheriff's office, because that was the thing she'd been turning over in her mind since midnight and the 3 horses at her gate. Sheriff Pat Connolly was not, as far as she could determine, actively in Caldwell's pocket. He was something more complicated, and in some ways worse. Which was a man who'd decided that looking the other way was easier than looking straight ahead. She didn't trust him, but she needed him to understand what was coming. Because if Caldwell decided to get physical about today, she wanted Connolly on record as knowing. She walked into his office without knocking. Connolly was behind his desk, a big man going to softness in the middle, with a face that perpetually suggested he'd rather be anywhere other than where he was. He looked up at Emily, and then at Thomas behind her, and then at Margaret filling the doorway, and something behind his eyes shifted. "Miss Whitaker," he said carefully. "Sheriff." Emily put the satchel on his desk. She didn't sit. "I want to inform you that Aldous Webb from the Prescott Legal Office is arriving in town today, along with representatives of the Western Pacific Railroad Board. They're here to investigate fraudulent land easement and bank collusion in this county, conducted over the past 18 months by William Caldwell and County Assessor Dale Pitts." She held his gaze. "That satchel contains signed statements from 4 landowner families documenting specific acts of fraud against them. I'm leaving you a copy as a courtesy because I believe in keeping the law informed." She paused. "I'd also like to note for the record that 3 armed men came to my property last night at 2 in the morning to deliver a cash offer on behalf of Mr. Caldwell. I turned them away. If anyone from Caldwell's operation comes to my property again, day or night, I will be expecting you to respond." Connolly looked at the satchel. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Emily for a long, complicated moment. Nobody said anything. Then Connolly put his hand on the satchel and drew it slowly toward him. "I appreciate the information, Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice was careful. "I'll review this material. Thank you." "Sheriff," she turned to go. "Miss Whitaker." She stopped but didn't turn back. "I want you to know what Beaumont told you about your account category. I've thought about that. I should have." He stopped himself. Started again. It wasn't right. She stood with her back to him for a moment. "No," she said, "it wasn't." She walked out. Thomas fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. And when they were clear of the door, he said very quietly, "Well done." "I don't want his guilty conscience," Emily said. "I want him to do his job." "Those 2 things are not always unrelated," Thomas said. Webb arrived at 11:47. Emily knew the exact time because she'd been watching the road from outside the telegraph office, drinking coffee that had gone cold, when the 4 riders came in from the Prescott direction. 3 men and a woman, the woman she hadn't expected. And neither had Thomas, judging by the way he straightened slightly when he saw her. The woman was about 40, with a lawyer's coat and a rider's posture, and a face that suggested she had done this before and found it more interesting than tedious. The man in front, lean, clean-shaven, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, swung down from his horse and looked directly at Thomas. "Tom," he said, "you look like you've been sleeping in a desert." "Approximately," Thomas said. And they shook hands with the efficiency of men who'd been in difficult situations together before. "Aldous, thank you for coming. Thank your telegraph." Webb looked at Emily. "This is Miss Whitaker?" "Emily Whitaker," she said, and put out her hand. He shook it like he meant it. "Aldous Webb. The woman behind me is Clara Sutton. She's the board's legal counsel." He glanced back at the other 2 men, who were tying their horses. "We left Prescott before sunrise." "What's the situation?" "Changing fast," Thomas said. "Let's get inside." They used the back room of the telegraph office. Silas Pruitt apparently having decided once and for all which direction his conscience pointed. Vacated it without being asked, stood guard at the front counter with the expression of a man who intended to know nothing about what was happening behind him. Emily spread the documents across the table, their organized stacks. Margaret's ledger, the 4 family statements, and stood at the head while Webb and Clara Sutton and the 2 board men read. It was the longest 40 minutes of her life. She stood because she needed to. She answered questions when they were asked dates, amounts, names, sequences, and she answered them cleanly and directly, the way her father had taught her to speak to people who needed information and not decoration. Margaret sat at the table and walked Webb through her ledger entry by entry. Thomas handled the railroad-specific elements, the survey route, the false representations Caldwell had made to investors about land ownership status. When it was done, Clara Sutton looked up from the documents, removed her reading glasses, and said, "This is sufficient." The room went very quiet. "For criminal referral?" Thomas asked. "For criminal referral, for civil injunction, and for board action on the survey routing." Sutton's voice was measured and precise. "The fraud is documented, the pattern is clear, and Caldwell's representations to our investors about land status constitute wire fraud under federal statute." She paused. "We can have an injunction on the Whitaker foreclosure filed with the federal court in Phoenix today by telegraph. It'll be enforceable by tomorrow morning." Emily put her hand flat on the table. Not because she needed to steady herself, because she needed to feel something solid under her palm. "Today," she said. "Today," Sutton confirmed. She looked at Emily with an expression that was not soft but was not without warmth. "You kept very good records, Miss Whitaker." "My mother taught me to write clearly," Emily said. Her voice was steady. "Barely. She did you a service." Webb was already pulling out his own papers. "I need to send 3 telegraphs. Tom, I'll need you to verify the board member signatures on the routing documentation." He stopped and looked up, because the door at the back of the room had opened. Silas Pruitt put his head in, and his face had gone the particular color of a man who'd just seen something he'd been hoping not to see. "Caldwell's here," he said, "out front. He's got Cross with him and 2 other men. And he's asking where Miss Whitaker is." The room processed this in about 2 seconds. Thomas looked at Emily. Emily looked at Webb. Webb looked at Clara Sutton, who had already stood up and was smoothing her coat with the calm efficiency of a woman who found confrontations professionally useful. "How public is the front of this office?" Sutton asked Silas. "Main Street," Silas said. "Middling busy, good." Sutton picked up a copy of the injunction filing. "Then let's go be visible." Emily stepped out the front door of the telegraph office onto the main street of Caldwell Crossing. And the morning hit her full in the face, the noise of it, the openness of it, the feeling of doing something in daylight that could not be taken back. Caldwell was standing 20 feet away. He'd come prepared for this, or thought he had. He was wearing his good coat, and Cross stood at his shoulder like punctuation. And behind them, 2 men Emily didn't know hovered with the patient stillness of people hired to communicate a certain kind of message without words. A handful of townspeople had stopped to watch. Dorothea Marsh was on the boardwalk across the street. Harlan Hennessy, she noticed, was standing out the feed store with his arms crossed and his chin up. Caldwell looked at Emily, and then his eyes moved to the people filing out behind her. Thomas, Webb, Sutton, Margaret, the 2 board men, and she watched his face do its mathematics. She watched him calculating, reassessing, and then putting on the expression he used when he'd decided to bluff through. "Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice was easy, his eyes were not. "I see you've gathered quite a little group, Mr. Caldwell." She stood on the boardwalk with her hands quiet at her sides. "I'd like to introduce you to some people. This is Aldous Webb, of the Prescott Legal Office. This is Clara Sutton, legal counsel to the Western Pacific Railroad Board. And I believe you know Thomas Harrington." Caldwell looked at Thomas. And for the first time in their acquaintance, Emily saw something real move through William Caldwell's face. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the expression of a man watching a door close that he'd believed was standing open. "Tom," he said. "Quiet, almost careful," William Thompson said. In exactly the same tone, Cross leaned in toward Caldwell and said something fast and low. Caldwell didn't respond to it. He was still looking at Thomas with that expression of a man recalculating. "Whatever she's Caldwell began. Mr. Caldwell." Clara Sutton stepped forward with a document in her hand, and her voice cut across his cleanly. "I'm filing a federal injunction today that will halt the foreclosure on the Whitaker property pending investigation. I'm also initiating a formal inquiry into the land assessment practices in this county, which will include a review of your representations to Western Pacific investors regarding the status of properties along the proposed spur line." She held the document out toward him. "This is notification of that inquiry. You are legally required to preserve all documents relating to your land acquisitions in this county for the past 24 months. Cross stepped forward. "On whose authority Federal Railroad Commission," Sutton said. And the flatness of it shut him down mid-stride. "You're welcome to verify that." "Mr. Cross, I'd suggest doing so quickly." Caldwell took the document from Sutton's hand. He looked at it. Emily watched his eyes move across the page. The boardwalk was completely silent. Then Dorothea Marsh's voice came from across the street. "William Caldwell," she said loudly, "you told my husband last spring that the Briggs parcel was worth $200, when we all knew it was worth $8. You want to explain that to the Railroad Commission too?" Somebody else, a man Emily didn't recognize, spoke up from down the street. "He bought the Morrison water rights for nothing. Said the survey came in wrong." "That survey came in wrong because Dale Pitts is in his pocket." Caldwell's head came up. He looked at the street around him, at the people who had stopped, at the faces turned toward him, at the town that had been watching quietly for 18 months, and had apparently decided was the day to stop being quiet. Something shifted in his face again. The bluff expression was gone now. What replaced it was harder to read, and Emily spent a moment reading it anyway. He was looking at her, just her. "You did this," he said. It wasn't a Keld's gaze. "I kept records," she said. "And I asked for help when I needed it. That's all. Your little ranch he started is not for sale," she said. "Was never for sale. Will not be for sale." Her voice was even and completely final. "That's the last time I'll say it." Cross touched Caldwell's arm. "William, get your hands off me." Caldwell shook him off without looking at him. He was still looking at Emily, and she looked back. And the thing passing between them had no words attached to it. It was the look of a man who had bet everything on a particular understanding of how the world worked and was discovering, in front of an audience, that his understanding was wrong. He looked at Thomas. "I don't know what you think you're protecting," he said. "I'm not protecting anything," Thomas said. "I'm correcting a wrong." "There's a difference." He paused. "You know that, William. I think somewhere you still know that." Caldwell folded the document, put it in his breast pocket, looked once more at Emily with an expression she would carry with her for a long time, not defeat, not contrition, something more complicated than either, and then he turned and walked back toward his horse. Cross hesitated for one beat, looking at the group on the boardwalk, at Sutton, at Webb, at Thomas. Then he followed, the two men behind them followed. The street watched them go in silence, and then Harlan Hennessy, outside the feed store, began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by the man who'd spoken up about the Morrison water rights, and then by someone on the boardwalk Emily couldn't see, and then by Dorothea Marsh of all people, Dorothea Marsh who'd told her a woman her size running a ranch by herself wasn't dignified. Dorothea Marsh clapping with an expression on her face that looked, if Emily was reading it right, like the particular shame of someone who'd been watching the wrong thing for too long. Emily didn't feel triumphant. She felt real. Fully present in her own life in a way she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She felt the boardwalk under her boots and the Arizona sun on her face and the solid knowledge that she was standing on the right side of the right moment and that every single thing she'd done to get here every early morning, every fence mended, every loan request she'd walked into and walked back out of had been exactly worth it. Thomas put a hand briefly on her shoulder. That was all. Just a hand on her shoulder for a moment, and then he moved past her to speak to Webb. It was enough. Webb sent 3 telegraphs from Silas Pruett's office in the next hour. And Silas sent them with the speed of a man who'd picked his side and was committed to it now. The injunction request went to Phoenix. A fraud referral went to the federal marshal's office. A third, Emily, didn't read this one, but Thomas told her afterward, went to the Western Pacific Board chairman in San Francisco with a full account of Caldwell's misrepresentations to investors. Clara Sutton sat at Silas's counter and drafted while telegraphs flew, working with the focused efficiency of someone who was genuinely in her element. Webb made notes. The 2 board men, whose names Emily finally learned were Foster and Krause, talked in low voices in the corner and periodically asked Thomas questions that Thomas answered with the precision of a man who'd been preparing for this for longer than Emily had known about. At one point, Foster looked at Emily across the cluttered office and said, "Miss Whitaker, I want to ask you something directly. If the rail spur goes through this county, through the routing that follows your land, are you prepared to negotiate a right-of-way easement with the railroad? Fair market terms, properly documented, with your own legal counsel." Emily looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared to negotiate anything. With proper terms and proper counsel. What I'm not prepared to do is have anything taken from me because someone with more money decided they wanted it." Foster nodded, and something in his expression shifted toward a respect that felt clean rather than complicated. "That's a fair position," he said. "It's the only position I've ever had," Emily said. Dale Pitts, county assessor, came into the telegraph office at 2 in the afternoon. He hadn't been summoned. He came of his own accord, which told Emily something important about how the morning's events on the main street had rippled through town. He was a small man, Pitts, slight and thin-faced, with the kind of mustache that tried harder than necessary, and he came in with his hat in his hands, and the posture of someone walking into a conversation he'd been dreading for months. He asked for Webb. Webb spoke with him for 20 minutes in the back room while Emily sat outside and waited, her boots on Silas's counter and her hands in her lap, and her mind doing the thing it always did when she was trying not to be impatient, which was plan. She planned fence repairs. She planned the cattle rotation for fall. She planned what she'd plant in the kitchen garden if she had time, which she hadn't had in 8 months. When Webb came out, his expression was carefully neutral in the way that meant things had gone well. "Pitts is going to cooperate," he said. "Voluntarily?" Thomas asked. "Enthusiastically," Webb said, and the dry edge in his voice communicated everything that needed to be communicated about what Dale Pitts's enthusiasm actually cost him. Margaret Doyle, who'd been sitting in the corner with her ledger on her knee, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. 6 families, she said. 18 months. And all it took was somebody actually showing up. It took more than that, Thomas said. And he was looking at Emily when he said it. Emily looked back at him. "The bank," she said. "Beaumont, has he actually filed the extension?" Thomas nodded. "I checked this morning. 90 days as agreed. And with the injunction, the foreclosure is suspended pending the federal inquiry," Sutton said from behind her stack of papers, "which will take significantly longer than 90 days to resolve. Effectively, Miss Whitaker, your property is not going anywhere." Emily closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She didn't pray. She wasn't much of a prayer. In the formal sense, her faith was a more private thing, between her and the land and the memory of her parents. But she did, in those 3 seconds, say something that wasn't quite a prayer but was close. Something that started with "thank you" and went somewhere wordless after that. Then she opened her eyes. "What happens to Caldwell?" she asked. Webb leaned against the counter. That depends on what the federal marshal finds. The fraud on investor representations is federal, that's serious. And Cross's involvement makes it more so. The local assessor manipulation is likely a state matter. He'll face both. He paused. It won't happen overnight. These things take time and courts and lawyers. But the machinery is in motion. And once it is, he shrugged. Men like Caldwell don't usually find it stops. Emily nodded slowly. She thought about Caldwell's face on the main street. The closing door. She didn't feel sorry for him. She wasn't sure she was capable of feeling sorry for him. And she didn't spend energy pretending otherwise. But she also found checking inside herself the way you check the temperature of water to see if it was safe to drink, that she didn't feel vindicated either, not the way she expected to. What she felt was lighter, like something she'd been carrying for a very long time had been set down in the right place. She became aware that the office had gotten quieter, and she looked up to find that several people had come in: Harlan Hennessy, and the man from the street whose name she still didn't know, and two women she recognized from the far end of town. They were all looking at her with expressions that combined to make a thing she hadn't felt from this town in longer than she could clearly remember. Respect. Plain, uncomplicated, unhidden. Miss Whitaker, Hennessy said. He was holding his hat the same way Pitts had held his. But the resemblance ended there. Hennessy's was a gesture of courtesy, not contrition. I just wanted to say, stop. Try it again. My wife said I should have gone to you months ago. When the assessment first came in wrong, she said somebody needed to make a fuss. And she was right. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at Emily.
You made the fuss. My family is grateful.
Emily looked at him for a moment. I just kept record, she said again. But this time when she said it, she was almost smiling. The afternoon lengthened and the telegraph office became, by degrees, an unofficial headquarters for what Emily was privately thinking of as the unraveling of William Caldwell. Webb and Sutton worked. Thomas consulted. Margaret Doyle served as a one-woman archive of 6 families' worth of grievances, producing specific details and specific dates with an accuracy that made Clara Sutton's eyebrows rise twice. At 4 o'clock, a telegraph came in from Phoenix. Silas read it, and his face went through something large and complicated. And then he came to Emily specifically and handed it to her, which she thought was a choice he made deliberately. She read it. Federal injunction on the Whitaker property foreclosure. Granted. Effective immediately. She handed it to Thomas. He read it and set it down on the counter without theatrics. But his hands were not entirely still. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. Outside, the Arizona sun was moving toward the mountains, going from brutal to golden in the way it always did this time of day, as if apologizing for what it had done for the previous 8 hours. Emily stood in the doorway of Silas Pruett's telegraph office on the main street of Caldwell Crossing and looked at the town, her town, the one that had watched her struggle and mostly looked away and today had chosen differently. She thought about the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket, the one she'd found at sunrise 2 mornings ago and folded carefully and hadn't thrown away, because she'd needed to remember what it felt like to read it, and to keep going anyway. She reached into her pocket and took it out. She looked at it one more time. Then she folded it one final time, walked to the cold stove in the corner of Silas's office, opened the grate and put it in. It caught quickly and was gone in seconds. Thomas, who'd been watching, said nothing. He didn't need to. She put her hat on and turned back to the room. All right, she said. What else needs doing? There was something strange about riding home that evening. Emily had ridden this road 100 times, 1,000 times. Probably, if she counted back to childhood, and it had always been just a road. Hard-packed dirt between scrub and rock, familiar as breathing. But that evening, with the injunction in her pocket, and 4 hours of legal work behind her, and the particular exhaustion of a day that had demanded every single thing she had, the road felt different, not softer, Just real. In a way it hadn't been for months. Like she'd been living in the conditional tense for so long. If I can keep the ranch. If I can find the money. If I can just get to the other side of this. And now she was back in the present. The actual solid breathing present. Thomas rode beside her without talking. Which she'd come to understand was one of his better qualities. He knew when words were beside the point. They were a mile from home when he said, "You should sleep tonight, I intend to. More than 3 hours." She glanced at him. "How do you know I slept 3 hours?" "Because I slept none." "And you looked better than me this morning, which sets the upper limit." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Tomorrow will have its own demands. Webb and Sutton will need you in town again." "Probably. The formal statements from the other families need to be signed in front of Webb's clerk. There's the matter of the assessor's office, Thomas. She used his name the same way he'd used hers that morning, plain. Like a fact." He stopped talking. "I know what tomorrow has." "I'll be ready for it." She paused. "I've been ready for every hard day for 8 months. I don't think that stops now." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't expect it does." They rode the last mile home in the kind of silence that had stopped being awkward somewhere around day 2 and become something else. Comfortable wasn't quite the right word for it. Because comfortable suggested ease, and nothing about the past 3 days had been easy. Honest was closer. The silence of two people who'd been through something together and didn't need to perform their feelings about it for each other. She fed the horses and he made coffee, and that's at the kitchen table for an hour that was quieter and less urgent than any hour since he'd appeared in her desert. And Emily felt, for the first time in longer than she could pinpoint, something that was close to peace. Not comfort, not security, those would come later, if they came, but peace. The knowledge that she'd done what was right and it had mattered, and that whatever came next, she'd face it the same way. She went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept for 9 hours straight without dreaming. Friday arrived without the weight it had carried 72 hours ago. Emily woke up knowing what day it was, the day that had been looming over her like a storm cloud since she'd found its notice on the post and found that it had been transformed overnight from a deadline into just a day. The injunction made it just a day. She dressed and went to the kitchen and found Thomas already up. Already with coffee, already looking at papers, and she thought, he hasn't changed his rhythm once, this man. Every morning the same. She respected that more than she had words for. "Webb sent a message," Thomas said when she came in. He nodded toward the counter, where a folded paper sat. "His clerk is at the hotel in town. He needs the Ortega and Briscoe families to come in this morning for formal signatures." He paused, and something in the pause caught her attention. "He also says Cross was picked up last night." Emily stopped in the middle of reaching for the coffee. "Picked up. Federal Marshal's deputy arrived from Phoenix late last night. Cross is in custody." Thomas's voice was even, but she could see something behind his eyes. Satisfaction. "Carefully restrained. They moved faster than I expected." Apparently, the telegraph to San Francisco prompted a response that clarified some things about Cross activities that were significant. What kind of significant? The kind that makes fast action appropriate. He looked at her steadily. "Caldwell hasn't been taken in yet. That may take longer. His lawyers are better than Cross's, and he has more to work with. But Cross was the mechanism, and without the mechanism, Caldwell's exposure is considerable." Emily poured her coffee and sat down. She thought about Percy Cross, flat-voiced, businesslike, delivering $800 offers in the dark. She thought about the Ortega family and midnight threats about water rights. She thought about 7 children and a sick mother, and a father told to stay quiet or face destruction. "Good," she said quietly, and she meant it without pleasure, which was the cleanest way to mean something like that. "There's one more thing." Thomas set down his cup. "Beaumont came to see me this morning, before you were up." "He came to the ranch." Emily looked at him sharply. "He came here?" He did a pause. "He wants to make a full accounting of the bank's involvement." Not because of the federal inquiry, he's going to cooperate with that regardless. He wants to come forward voluntarily, ahead of being compelled. Thomas looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. He wants to do it right, his words. Emily was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I told him that decision belonged to him and Webb, and that the only opinion that mattered from this household was yours. He asked if you'd see him. Thomas paused. You don't have to. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Gerald Beaumont, neat suit, carefully neutral expression. Accounts in your category. The way he'd looked at the desk instead of at her face. I should have. He can come, she said, this afternoon. After the signing in town. Thomas nodded once. I'll send word. The morning in town was efficient. Emily thought, slightly surreal, in the way that things are surreal when you've been dreading a place, and then arrived to find the air entirely changed. Webb's clerk, a young man named Harris, who wore spectacles and wrote with the focused intensity of someone who understood that what he was writing down mattered, had set up in the hotel's small meeting room. Emily arrived with Thomas to find Margaret Doyle already there. And 5 minutes later, the Ortega family came in together. Father, mother, and Jimmy, trailing behind them with the careful bearing of a young man who was understanding, for the first time, that the world could sometimes be moved. Elena Ortega signed first, and her hand was steady. And her husband put his hand briefly over hers after she finished. And Emily looked away from that moment because it felt private in a way she wanted to respect. The Briscoe family arrived 20 minutes later. Howard Briscoe was a large, quiet man of about 50 who shook Emily's hand without speaking, and then sat down and gave his statement in the flat, factual tone of someone who'd been holding it in a locked room for months and was relieved to let it out into the open air. By 10 o'clock, Harris had 4 signed statements. Witnessed, dated, and ready to travel to Phoenix. Clara Sutton, who had apparently not gone to the hotel to sleep but had spent the night completing paperwork that Emily suspected would fill a fair-sized cabinet, arrived at 10:15 with a file that she handed to Webb with the quiet satisfaction of someone delivering exactly what they'd promised. The investor fraud documentation is complete, she said. Combined with Pitts's cooperation and Cross in custody, the criminal referral is solid. She looked at Emily. The survey routing decision will be made by the board in approximately 6 weeks. I can't promise outcomes, Miss Whitaker. What I can tell you is that the decision will be made on legitimate grounds, with complete information, with no Caldwell involvement in the process. That's all I've ever wanted, Emily said. A fair chance. Sutton looked at her for a moment with something that went a little beyond professional regard. You'll have it, she said. Harlan Hennessy was waiting outside the hotel when Emily came out. He wasn't alone. There were 4 people with him, the man from the street whose name she'd finally learned was Dennis Cole, and Hennessy's wife Ruth, and 2 women Emily recognized as the Garfield sisters, who ran the boarding house on the east end of town. They were standing together in a loose group with the slightly uncertain energy of people who'd organized themselves around a purpose but weren't entirely sure how to begin executing it. Hennessy stepped forward when he saw her. Miss Whitaker, he said. We'd like to ask you something. Go ahead. He took a breath. The 6 families, the ones Caldwell went after we talked last night. The Cole family too, Dennis's folks, their situation's similar even if their paperwork isn't as clean. He looked at her directly. We want to do something. Together, not just sit back and wait for the law to work, he paused. Margaret said you know about the rail route. Said it goes through this county either way. That's right. And if Caldwell's out of it, the land situation changes. The routing could be negotiated by people who actually own the land it crosses. He paused again. And this time when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man saying something he'd thought hard about. We want to form an association, landowners, pool our resources, share legal costs, negotiate the rail easements together instead of separately. He looked at her. We want you to be part of it. More than part of it. We want you to help lead it. The boardwalk was quiet. Ruth Hennessy said, from behind her husband's shoulder. You're the one who kept records when the rest of us were too scared to. You're the one who didn't sell when they pushed. We should have done this 8 months ago. And we didn't, and I'm sorry for that. Her voice was plain and direct. But we're doing it now. Emily looked at the group of them. She thought about what she'd told Thomas 2 days ago in the kitchen, about what she'd do with the ranch if she could keep it. The North grazing land, 60 head of cattle, the Prescott rail line. She'd said it like a dream she'd learned not to have. She was learning that she'd been wrong to stop having it. Yes, she said. I'll be part of it. She looked at Hennessy. But I want Webb's advice on the structure before we formalize anything. And I want Clara Sutton to look at any easement agreement before it's signed. We do this right or we don't do it. Hennessy nodded. Agreed. Dennis Cole said agreed. Ruth Hennessy just smiled. Beaumont came to the ranch at 3 o'clock. He came alone, which Emily noted, and on a horse that was not his usual animal, a plain bay instead of the black he normally rode. As if some unconscious instinct had told him to arrive without his usual trappings. He tied the horse at the post himself instead of having someone hold it. Emily met him in the yard. She didn't invite him in immediately. She stood in the yard and let him come to her, and she watched him cover the distance between his horse and the place where she stood. And she watched his face as he did it. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not smaller in the literal sense, Beaumont was a large man. Heavy-set, always carefully turned out, but something in his bearing was compressed. Like he'd let air out of himself on the ride over. Miss Whitaker, he said. He stopped at a respectful distance. His hat was in his hands before he was consciously aware of having taken it off. Thank you for seeing me. Come inside, she said. Thomas was at the table when they came in, but he stood and moved toward the door before Beaumont had gotten through it. I'll check on the horses, he said, and went out, without looking at Beaumont, which Emily understood was a gift the conversation she was about to have needed to be between two people. Beaumont sat down at the table. Emily sat across from him. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Beaumont said, I need to tell you what happened. Not what I'm going to tell Webb that's going to be accurate. But it's going to be formal. I need to tell you what actually happened. From the beginning. Emily folded her hands on the table. I'm listening. He took a breath. 3 years ago. Caldwell came to me about his railroad investments. He wasn't a client, he was a local businessman, with money in local property and some regional influence. And he came to me with a proposition that seemed at the time. He stopped. No, that's not honest. It seemed profitable. It seemed low risk. He wanted to slow walk certain foreclosure decisions on properties in the rail corridor while he acquired adjacent land. In exchange, the bank would have preferential terms on the railroad financing when the line came through. He looked at his hands. I told myself it wasn't illegal, that I was just timing decisions. That every bank does that. Emily said nothing. The assessments that was Pitt's. Not me. I didn't know about the falsified documents until 6 months ago. He looked up at her then. But I knew the assessments were low. I used them anyway. I signed off on terms for loans secured against undervalued property because it kept the numbers where Caldwell needed them to be. He stopped. Your father's original loan. I want you to know that the rate on that was legitimate. The debt was real. I didn't invent it. A pause. But the rate I could have offered you when you came in to renegotiate the extension I told you wasn't available, those were things I had it in my power to give you. Caldwell asked me not to, and I didn't. The kitchen was very quiet. Emily looked at Gerald Beaumont across the table, at his large hands holding his hat with the steadiness of someone holding themselves together by an act of will, and she felt something complex move through her that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't its opposite. It was closer to comprehension, the understanding of how an ordinary man who wasn't evil had become useful to something that was. Why are you telling me this? She asked. You could cooperate with Webb without coming here. He looked at her directly. Because what I did had a face. It wasn't abstract. It was you walking into that office and me looking at my desk when you deserved to have someone look you in the eye and tell you the truth. His voice wasn't steady anymore. I should have looked at you. I should have told you what was happening, and I didn't. And whatever happens with the federal inquiry, that part that's between you and me. And I needed to come say it. Emily was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear Thomas moving around at the soft sound of boots on packed earth. The low voice he used with the horses when he thought no one was listening. Mr. Beaumont, she said finally, what you did was wrong. You know that. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. She paused. But coming here took something. Saying it out loud something. She held his gaze. I won't tell you it's all right, because it wasn't. What I will tell you is that the path you're on now is the right one. And I hope you stay on it. He looked at her for a moment. And his jaw worked once. Your father came into that bank, he said quietly. The year before he died. He came in to refinance. And we talked for an hour. He stopped. He was the kind of man that made you want to be better than you were. I thought about that after he was gone. I should have thought about it more. Emily pressed her lips together. Yes, she said softly. He put his hat back on and stood. Thank you, he said. Go cooperate with Webb, she said. That's the thank you I need. He nodded once and walked out. Thomas came back 10 minutes later and found Emily standing at the window. Not looking at anything in particular. He didn't ask how it went. He went to the stove and refilled the coffee and set a cup in front of where she usually sat. And then he sat down himself and picked up the papers he'd been working on before Beaumont arrived. And he was quiet. After a few minutes, she came and sat down. He knew my father, she said. Most people in this town knew your father, not the way they should have. She wrapped her hands around the cup. He was worth knowing. He was really worth knowing. And most of them, she stopped. He knew it, Thomas said. The people who mattered to him knew it. She looked at him. He knew you, she said. For 20 minutes, 23 years ago. 20 minutes was enough to know the important things. Thomas looked at her over the rim of his cup. The same 20 minutes that taught me his daughter was going to be someone worth knowing too. She looked away. Because something had happened to her throat that she needed a moment to address. You're going to Prescott soon, she said. Monday, he said. The board meeting. I need to be there in person for the routing decision process. He paused. It'll take 2 or 3 weeks at minimum. And after? He was quiet for a moment. I have a house in San Francisco that I haven't spent enough time in. Board responsibilities. The railroad doesn't run itself, though it sometimes seems to think it can. He paused again. But I've also been thinking that the routing decision will require ongoing work with the landowner association you've just agreed to help organize. The easement negotiations alone will take months. He looked at her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away but showed everything if you knew where to look. I expect I'll be back through this county fairly regularly. Is that professional or personal? Emily asked. The question surprised him, she could see it, and then something in his face settled into something warmer than his usual careful expression. Both, he said, if that's acceptable. It's acceptable, she said. The days that followed moved differently than the days before. Not easier, there was nothing easy about the amount of work that descended on the ranch in the week after Thursday. Webb needed Emily for 3 more formal sessions. The landowner association required 2 organizational meetings in Margaret Doyle's front room, with more talking and more coffee than Emily was used to. And the careful process of getting 6 independent families to agree on anything taught her things about human nature she hadn't known she needed to know. Clara Sutton corresponded with her twice by telegraph about the structure of the rail easement framework. And Emily wrote back with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that words in legal context meant exactly what they said, and not one syllable more. The cattle needed attention regardless of what was happening with lawyers and telegraphs. The fence on the north line needed repair. Two of the younger animals were off their feed in a way that required watching. She worked. She kept working. That was the thing that hadn't changed and wasn't going to. But there was a morning, about a week after Thursday, when she walked out to feed the horses before dawn and stopped for a moment in the yard in the dark and just stood. The air was cool and dry, the way Arizona air was in the hour before heat. And it smelled like dust and hay and the particular mineral scent of the desert at night. The stars were still out. She stood in the yard of her ranch, her parents' ranch. Her ranch, the 40 acres her father had built from nothing, and she breathed. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing she noticed. Standing there in the dark. For 8 months, every morning had started with a low, persistent hum of fear, underneath everything else, underneath the work. The plans, the determination, fear of losing it, fear of not being enough. Fear of the thing that Caldwell represented, which wasn't just a man but an entire system of people who decided her size and her gender and her circumstances made her someone whose land could be taken. That morning, standing in the dark yard, the fear was gone. Not because the work was over, not because everything was resolved or safe or finished, but because she'd learned something about herself in the past week that she'd been too busy surviving to fully understand, that she was the kind of person who looked up when things went bad and figured out what needed doing and did it. That she'd always been that person. That no amount of contempt from Caldwell Crossing, from Caldwell himself, from anyone with an opinion about her size or her circumstances, or what a woman like her ought to do with herself, had been able to change what she actually was. She knew what she was now. She'd known for a while, if she was honest with herself. She'd just needed 8 months of impossible mornings and one dying stranger in the desert to finish the process of being sure. Thomas was leaving Monday. She'd said goodbye to very few people in her life. Her parents were not people she'd said goodbye to. They were people who had simply been there and then were not, and she was not entirely certain how to do it with the right amount of honesty and the right amount of dignity for both of them. She'd been turning it over in the week since Thursday, in the minutes between work and sleep, trying to find the shape of what needed to be said. On Sunday evening she made dinner. A real dinner, not the hasty meals they'd been making between sessions of work, but something that used the good cuts she'd been saving and the dried herbs from the garden and the last of the flour she'd bought before the world had changed direction. Thomas set the table without being asked, which was something she'd noticed him doing all week, the small, practical courtesies of a man who understood that a ranch ran on 10,000 small acts of maintenance and didn't need to be told which ones needed doing. They ate, and the conversation was the kind of conversation she'd found herself having with him, increasingly, about things that didn't relate directly to lawyers or railroads or the landowner association. He told her about his first rail survey, when he was 22, and convinced that the future was going to be built on iron and determination, and not much else. She told him about her mother's kitchen garden, which her mother had maintained with a seriousness that was almost military. Because her mother believed that a woman who grew her own food was a woman who couldn't be made completely helpless. She was right, Thomas said. She was right about most things, Emily said. She was harder to live with than my father because of it. He laughed a real laugh. Not the careful half-smile she'd seen in the early days. And she found she'd been waiting for it, without knowing she was waiting for it. After dinner she washed the dishes and he dried them, standing at the counter side by side in the warm kitchen. And she thought, this is an ordinary thing. This is what ordinary life looks like. She hadn't had ordinary life in so long that the specific texture of it caught her off guard. I want to say something, she said, handing him a plate. Before tomorrow. All right. What you did this week, it wasn't repayment. She kept her eyes on the basin. I know you know that, but I want to say it out loud anyway. You didn't owe me anything for the water. You don't owe my father anything for the canyon. What you did because it was right. She handed him the last cup. I want you to know that I know the difference. He was quiet for a moment, drying the cup. "I know you know it," he said. "That's partly why I did it." She turned to look at him. "Only partly," she said. Something moved across his face that was warmer than his usual expression and more complicated. "The other part," he said, "is that you earned it. Every piece of it. Not because of who your father was, and not because you gave me water. Because of what you did with 40 acres and a debt and a town that had decided you weren't worth looking at." He looked at her steadily. "You built something this week, Emily. Not just the legal case. You built something in this county that's going to matter for a long time. People who were alone aren't alone anymore. That's your work." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back," she said. It came out plainer than she intended. And she didn't walk it back. "I'll be back," he said. "For the easement negotiations at the very least." "At the very least," she agreed. He nodded once, and that was all they needed, because some things didn't need elaborating. She slept well that night, too. Monday morning she was at the gate when he rode out. She'd saddled Luther herself and checked the cinch twice. Because some habits didn't stop. He'd packed light, he'd arrived with almost nothing, and was leaving with nearly the same. He stopped at the gate and looked back at her. "The North Grazing Land," he said. "Don't wait too long on that. 60 head is the right number." "Your instincts are good." "I know they are," she said. He tipped his hat. She put her hand up once and then he rode. And she stood at the gate and watched him until the rowboat bent and took him out of sight. And then she stood a moment longer, her hand on the gatepost, her father's hat on her head, the morning coming in hard and warm and full of work. Then she turned around and went to do it. The ranch was hers. The land was hers. The future was hers, and she had never once needed anyone to give it to her. She had only ever needed the chance to keep what she'd already built. That chance was here now, and Emily Rose Whitaker, all of her. Every pound and every scar and every early morning and every night she'd chosen to keep going was ready for every single thing it would ask of her. 6 weeks passed the way hard work always passes, faster than rest and slower than you want it to. Each day full enough that you fell into bed at night with the particular satisfaction of a person who had spent themselves completely and intended to do it again tomorrow. Emily didn't wait for the world to come to her. She never had. The North Grazing Land was the first thing she moved on the week after Thomas left. She rode the full perimeter of it twice, measuring in her head the way her father had taught her. Calculating carrying capacity against water access, against the cost of expanding the herd. The numbers worked. They worked better than she'd expected. Actually, because she'd been conservative in her estimates the way you got conservative when you'd been scared for long enough. She stopped being conservative. She bought 12 head from Harlan Hennessy at a fair price. Hennessy insisted it was fair. Wouldn't take more, said it was the least he could do. And Emily let him say it without arguing, because she understood that some people needed to give something back in order to feel right with themselves again. She understood that now more than she had before. The association met every 2 weeks in Margaret Doyle's front room. And the meetings were loud and occasionally contentious and always productive. Which Emily had come to understand was the only kind of productive worth having. Howard Briscoe turned out to have strong opinions about water rights that were almost entirely correct. Dennis Cole's father, it emerged, had been a surveyor before he came west. And his understanding of property lines added a precision to their discussions that Clara Sutton, communicating by telegraph from Prescott, said she found professionally refreshing. They were building something. Emily could feel it the way you felt the frame of a structure going up, the solidity of each new piece adding to the solidity of the whole. The shape of the thing becoming clear. She was 3 weeks into the North Grazing expansion when the first piece of news came about Caldwell. Margaret brought it. Because Margaret brought most news, she had a network of information that Emily had come to think of as a kind of informal telegraph system, running on the currency of women who talked to each other and were consistently underestimated for it. She came out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with her usual directness and a look on her face that said the news was significant. Caldwell's lawyers filed to have the fraud charges reduced, she said. Before she was fully through the door, Percy Cross is cooperating with the federal marshal in exchange for a lighter sentence. His cooperation includes apparently a great deal of detail about Caldwell's operations that Caldwell would very much prefer stay private. Emily set down the fence repair she'd been working on. How bad is it for him? The investor fraud alone is federal prison. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table with the ease of a woman who'd been sitting at that table long enough that it had stopped feeling like someone else's kitchen. But Cross gave them something else. Apparently, there are 2 other counties where Caldwell ran the same operation. Smaller, but the same pattern. Coordinated assessments. Bank pressure, strategic foreclosures. Emily absorbed this quietly. How many families, she asked. Webb still counting. Margaret's voice was flat and careful in the way it got when she was controlling her anger. At least 14, possibly more. 14 families. The same midnight visits, the same time deadlines. The same careful pressure designed to make people feel alone and small and without options. 14 families who hadn't had a Thomas Harrington appear in their desert. Emily stood there with the fence repair in her hands and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not triumph. Not vindication, but something heavier and more responsible than either. The weight of knowing that what had happened to her had happened to people who hadn't gotten out from under it. What does Webb need? She said. Margaret looked at her. What? From us. From the association. To support the other families, the ones in the other counties. Documentation, testimony, legal framework. She set the fence repair down. We've built something here that works. What does he need to extend it? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I'll ask him, she said finally. Ask Sutton, too, Emily said. She's sharper. She really is, Margaret agreed. And there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. The warmth of a woman who'd discovered that other women in this territory were worth being allied with. The telegraph from Thomas came on a Thursday 4 weeks after he'd ridden out. Almost to the day, Emily was in the barn when Jimmy Ortega appeared at the gate. Breathless, in the way he'd been breathless the first time he'd come to her. But with a different energy behind it, not alarm. Something more like anticipation. He handed her the folded paper and stood back with the patient restraint of a young man who badly wanted to know what it said. She read it. Routing decision confirmed. Stop Whitaker corridor. Approved stop easement negotiations. Begin next month. Stop arriving Friday. Stop to Harrington. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Jimmy, who was reading her face the way young people read the faces of adults they trusted for information they weren't getting from words. Good news, he said. Very good news, Emily said. He broke into a grin that took up most of his face. I'll tell Mama, he said, and turned his horse and rode. Presumably on the theory that good news traveled best at speed. Emily stood in the barn doorway holding the telegraph. The routing decision. The North land, her father's land. The 40 acres of hard Arizona ground that William Caldwell had decided was his to take was going to be part of the rail corridor. Not because Caldwell had maneuvered it. Not because anyone had cheated or pressured or falsified a document. Because it was the right geography and the decision had been made on legitimate grounds. She put the telegraph in her apron pocket next to where the foreclosure notice used to live and went back to work. Thomas arrived Friday afternoon. And he arrived differently than he'd left. He wasn't alone. There was a lawyer from Prescott, a young man named Garrett, who worked under Sutton and had the focused energy of someone who understood he was there to work and not to observe. There was a railroad surveyor named Chen, quiet and methodical, who immediately began looking at the north pasture with professional interest. And there was a woman Emily didn't recognize, about 50, with a direct gaze and clothing that suggested she'd ridden a considerable distance and intended to ride more. Thomas introduced her as Catherine Rowe. She runs the Rowe Land Cooperative in northern New Mexico, he said. She heard about what you built here. She came to look at it. Emily looked at Catherine Rowe. Catherine Rowe looked back at her with the frank assessment of a woman who had very limited patience for pretense and very deep respect for demonstrated competence. "I heard you organize 6 families in 3 days," Catherine said. "In a county where Caldwell had been running his operation for 18 months. Margaret Doyle organized them," Emily said. "I just gave her somewhere to point it." "That's what leadership looks like," Catherine said. "I'd like to talk to you about some things if you have time." "I can make time," Emily said. Thomas, she noticed, was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who had arranged something and was pleased with how it was landing. She gave him a look that communicated this observation. He tipped his hat. She almost laughed. The next 3 days were the busiest Emily had known since the week of the crisis. But differently busy, the kind of busy that felt like construction rather than survival. Garrett worked with the association members on the easement framework. Chen surveyed the Northland with the meticulous thoroughness of someone for whom precision was a form of respect. Catherine Rowe sat at Emily's kitchen table and talked about cooperative models, about collective bargaining with large corporate interests, about the things that worked and the things that didn't, with the authority of someone who'd learned them by doing. Emily listened more than she talked. She asked questions that made Catherine stop and reconsider her answers, which Catherine seemed to find more valuable than quick agreement. By the second evening, they were talking less like a mentor and a student, and more like two people with different pieces of a problem, working toward the same shape of solution. "You should come to New Mexico," Catherine said on the second evening. "In the spring. See what we've built there. It's different from what you're doing here. But there are things that could transfer." "I'm not sure I can leave the ranch for that long in spring," Emily said. "Bring whoever you need to manage it while you're gone." Catherine looked at her steadily. "Emily, what you're building here has implications beyond this county. What happened to your families here is happening to families all over this territory. If the people who figured out how to fight it don't talk to each other, they'll keep fighting the same battles separately while the Caldwells of the world share information freely." She paused. "Think about it." Emily thought about it. She was still thinking about it when she and Thomas walked the north pasture the following morning. Just the two of them, the survey work done, and the lawyers deep in their drafting, and the ranch, doing what ranches did, regardless of what humans were deciding around them. "Catherine wants me to come to New Mexico in spring," Emily said. "I know. I may have suggested to her that you'd be worth talking to." He glanced at her sideways. "Was that overstepping?" "It depends on what you thought it would lead to." "I thought it would lead to exactly what's happening," he said. "Someone worth talking to. Talking to someone worth talking to." She looked at the Northland ahead of them, the good grazing land she hadn't been able to touch for months, now coming into use the way her father had always said it could. "You've been arranging things," she said. "Not accusatory. Observational." "I've been introducing people to each other," he said carefully. "The things that happen after that are their own." "There's a difference?" "A significant one." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be honest with you about something. You usually are. When I came to the board meeting in Prescott, the routing decision was already leaning your direction. Not because of anything I did, the geography is what it is. And the survey was clear. But I had the opportunity to present the full picture of what Caldwell had been doing. And I did, and it removed the last uncertainty." He paused. "The decision would likely have been the same without me. But I wanted you to know that I used every piece of influence I have in that room in your direction. Not because of your father, not because you gave me water. Because I've sat at your kitchen table for a week and watched you work. And I believe in what you're doing here." Emily was quiet for a moment, looking at the land ahead. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, thank you for telling me." She kept her eyes forward. "And thank you for using it." They walked a little further in comfortable silence. "The easement terms," she said. "Garrett says they're fair. They are. I made sure of it." The other counties the families Caldwell went after elsewhere. Webb is building a case that uses our documentation as framework.
Yes.
It may take years, but it will hold. He paused. You started something here that goes further than 40 acres. You understand that. I'm beginning to, she said. The evening before Thomas was due to leave again, this time for San Francisco, for a board session that would take a month, Emily came out of the barn after the late feeding and found him standing at the fence of the north pasture. Looking at the new cattle in the failing light, she stood beside him. The animals were settling for the night, the low sounds of a herd at ease carrying across the quiet. The stars were beginning in the east. The air was cooling toward the particular sharpness that preceded a clear Arizona night. My father stood at this fence, she said, every evening. He said it was the best part of the day when the work was done and the animals were settled and you could just look at what you'd built. Thomas was quiet. He would have loved this, she said. What this week has been. He'd have loved seeing you doing it. She felt that land somewhere deep. He'd have liked you, she said again. She'd said it before. But it needed saying again. He'd have really liked you. I know it, Thomas said. And the way he said it, not modest, not deflecting. Just accepting it as a simple truth, told her something about who he was that she wouldn't forget. They stood at the fence for a while longer, not speaking. Just present in the same moment, in the way that was only possible between people who had been through something real together and come out the other side with their respect for each other intact. He rode out the next morning. Same as before, Emily was at the gate. This time he didn't just tip his hat. He stopped his horse and looked at her for a moment, really looked. The way he had in the desert when she'd pressed the canteen to his lips and he'd looked at her like a man who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then he reached into his coat and took out an envelope and handed it down to her. Don't open it until I'm gone, he said. She took it. What is it? Something I should have written years ago and didn't. And something I should say now in a form that doesn't disappear when I ride out. He held her gaze. I'll be back in a month. The easement signing will need your signature in person. Garrett can't do it by proxy. He paused. And I'd like to see how the north herd settles. Come back, she said. The same words as before. The same plainness. She wasn't walking it back this time either. I'll be back, he said. He rode. She stood at the gate until the road bent and took him from sight. Then she looked down at the envelope in her hands. She opened it. It was 2 pages in Thomas's small, precise hand. And it took her a moment to understand what she was reading. Then she understood. It was a letter to her father. Written as if Robert Whitaker could read it. Telling him about the canyon. About the 20 minutes. About the 40 years that had followed in which Thomas had tried to be the kind of man Robert Whitaker's brief example had suggested was possible. Telling him about the desert and the water and the daughter who had her father's eyes and her father's instinct for doing the right thing when it cost something. The last paragraph read, Your daughter is going to be all right. Robert. More than all right. She is going to be the kind of person that other people point to when they're trying to explain what courage actually looks like. Not the loud kind. The kind that gets up every morning and does what needs doing and doesn't stop. You raise that. You can be at rest knowing it. Emily stood at the gate for a long time. Then she folded the letter very carefully, the way her mother used to fold letters that mattered, and put it in her breast pocket. Close, she put her hat on, turned around, walked back into the yard of her ranch. The months that followed were the months Emily would look back on for the rest of her life, as the time when the world reorganized itself into the shape it had always been trying to reach. Caldwell's trial began in October. It was in Phoenix, before a federal judge, and it drew spectators from 3 counties and coverage in 2 Prescott newspapers. Cross had given the federal marshal everything: names, dates, amounts, the full 18-month architecture of what Caldwell had built. The investor fraud alone would have been enough. Combined with the coordinated assessment manipulation and the bank collusion across 3 counties, it was more than enough. Emily was called to testify. She rode to Phoenix with Margaret Doyle, who had decided she was coming and hadn't asked anyone's permission, and Harlan Hennessy, who had decided the same thing. The three of them rode the train from Prescott, Emily's first time on a train, a fact she allowed herself to find privately significant given everything, and arrived in Phoenix on a Tuesday morning. She testified for 2 hours. She was asked about the foreclosure timeline, about Beaumont's denial of the extension, about Caldwell's series of offers, and the midnight visit from Cross. She answered every question clearly and directly, in the voice her father had taught her to use when she needed to be heard, not loud. Not aggressive, just absolutely steady. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had something underneath it that volume alone couldn't produce. When Caldwell's lawyer tried to suggest that her land's strategic position along the rail corridor gave her a financial motivation to fabricate the fraud narrative, Emily looked at him with an expression that Margaret Doyle later described as the most effective silence she had ever witnessed, and then said, "The rail corridor value came after the injunction. Before it, I had a foreclosure notice and no money. If I was fabricating this for financial gain, I was remarkably poorly informed about my own situation." 3 people in the public gallery laughed. The judge did not laugh, but something at the corner of his mouth moved. Caldwell was convicted in November. 4 counts of federal fraud, 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. He was sentenced to 7 years at the federal penitentiary in Kansas. Dale Pitts received 3 years and forfeiture of his pension. Cross received 18 months in exchange for his cooperation. The news came to Emily by telegraph on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in the north pasture checking on the herd when Jimmy Ortega brought it out. Jimmy had apparently appointed himself her unofficial message carrier, a role he performed with the dedication of someone who understood that being trusted with information was its own kind of honor. She read the telegram. Then she looked up at the herd, 43 animals now, steady and settled on good grazing land, healthy and calm in the way that animals got when they were well cared for, and she said nothing for a while. Jimmy watched her face. He said, "That part of it," she said. "Yes. Is there another part?" She looked at him. He was 17 now, taller than he'd been in June. With the beginning of the man he was going to be visible in his face, alongside the boy he still was. "There's always another part," she said. "That's not bad news. It just means there's always more worth doing." She handed him back the telegram. "Tell your mother the verdict. She'll want to know." He rode. She stayed a while longer in the north pasture, among the cattle her father had always believed could be there, on the land he'd built and she'd kept, under an Arizona sky that didn't know or care about courts or verdicts or men named Caldwell, the sky that was just there, the way it had always been, wide and indifferent and beautiful. Thomas came back in December, as he'd said he would, and stayed through the holidays, which Emily had not expected and which she found she was not sorry about. The easement signing happened on a Tuesday, a formal affair at the hotel, with Garrett and 2 railroad representatives and the full association in attendance. And Emily signed her name on the document that established the rail easement across the north section of the Whitaker Ranch with the same steady hand she'd used in the Phoenix courtroom. Because it was the same hand, and it had always been steady when it needed to be. Afterward, in the quiet of the ranch kitchen, Thomas poured 2 glasses of the whiskey he'd brought from San Francisco and put one in front of her. "To Robert Whitaker," he said. "Who built something worth keeping?" "To Robert Whitaker," Emily said. They drank. Outside, the December wind moved across the Arizona land with the blunt honesty of something that didn't pretend to be gentle but could be endured. Had always been endured. Would be endured by the people who understood that endurance wasn't weakness, it was the longest form of strength there was. Catherine Rowe's invitation to New Mexico sat on the corner of Emily's desk. She'd written back. She was going in April, and she was bringing Margaret Doyle. Because Margaret had earned it, and because Emily had learned, in the past 6 months, that the things worth doing were better done with people who'd proven themselves in the fire. The association had 12 families now, 6 original. 6 more who'd heard what happened in Caldwell Crossing and come asking to be part of what was being built. Webb had used their documentation framework in the neighboring county cases and was building it into a template for other territories. Clara Sutton had mentioned Emily's name in a legal brief that went to Washington. Emily had not known about this until the brief arrived by post, and she had sat with it for a long time reading the paragraph that mentioned her before filing it carefully in the same drawer as her father's land deed. The North herd was 51 head by December. She was planning for 65 by spring. The ranch was hers. The land was solid under her feet. The future was not a word she was afraid of anymore. On the last night of the year, Emily sat on the porch steps, the same steps where she'd counted out her 60 seconds of fear all those months ago, and looked at the stars and thought about the year that was ending. Thomas was inside. She could hear him through the door, moving around the kitchen with the ease of a man who'd been in a place enough times that his body knew where things were without asking. She thought about a June morning and a foreclosure notice and a dying stranger in the desert. She thought about water given without knowing why it mattered. She thought about her father's voice, "A man doesn't help another man for money. He does it because that's what decent people do," and how that voice had been in her before she was old enough to have words for it, and how she'd carried it through every hard morning and every closed door and every moment when Caldwell Crossing had looked at her and seen someone dismissible. They had been wrong about her. They had always been wrong about her. Not because she was extraordinary, though she was, but because the things they'd dismissed her for were not weaknesses. Her size, her solitude, her stubbornness, her refusal to sell, her habit of doing what was right, even when it was expensive, none of those were weaknesses. They were exactly the things that had brought her through. The door opened and Thomas came out and sat beside her on the steps, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and handed her one without speaking. They sat together in the cold December night and looked at the stars over the Arizona desert. The same stars that had been there when her father arrived with $40 and a mule. The same stars that would be there long after all of them were gone. "Next year," Emily said. "Next year," he agreed. She looked up at the sky and felt complete. Not finished, not done. There was too much still ahead of her for done. But complete in the way that a thing was complete when it had become fully what it was always trying to be. She was Emily Rose Whitaker. She was 23 years old, and she owned 40 acres of good Arizona land, and a herd that was growing, and a network of people who had learned to trust each other, because she'd shown them how. She had her father's eyes and her mother's handwriting, and the capacity for kindness that had always been her most essential quality, the one that had looked like softness to the people who didn't understand it and had turned out, in practice, to be harder than anything Caldwell had brought against her. She had given water to a stranger in the desert because that was what decent people did. And the world had given her back everything she had ever deserved, not as charity, not as luck, but as the plain and honest consequence of being exactly who she was. Without apology, without compromise, without ever once becoming smaller to fit the space other people decided she should occupy. The stars burned overhead. The cattle settled in the north pasture. The ranch breathed around her, quiet and alive and entirely, irrevocably hers. Emily Rose Whitaker had not been saved. She had saved herself one morning at a time, one honest act at a time, one refusal to surrender at a time, and the life she was living now was not a gift from anyone. It was the life she had built with her own 2 hands, on her own terms, in her own name, and it was only just beginning.